Okay, so let's get started on the topic gender bias at work and why men make different career choices and also under which conditions they make different career choices. So you've probably seen something like this before. Stefan mentioned it in his introduction, that we have, about half of the workforce is female, but the higher up in the organizational ladder it goes, the fewer women we see. So that means on the director level, on the highest leadership positions, there are only 10–11% female leaders, versus they make up about half of the workforce. So that's called kind of a vertical gender inequality. So there's a difference between how many women make it up the career ladder versus how many women are in the on the lower organizational levels. And we also see a horizontal gender segregation, which means that we see men and women in different types of jobs. So there's, for example, more female nurses, but there's more male construction workers, more male engineers, those types of things. So there's also something happening that men and women choose these different jobs, or they are hired for these different positions. And as you'll see throughout the talk, it's often a mix of both. So maybe before I get started and tell you all about the theory and some research studies, I would like to just get your input a little bit. So what do you think is, I know there's a ton of reasons, it's a super complex topic, but what do you see as some major reasons for why we have fewer women in leadership, or why do men and women make these different types of choices? Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then so you think of a leader, you see a male person, and then what do you think does that do with? What do you think this matters basically?
It matters in terms of who we choose as our leaders, how we evaluate female leaders compared to male leaders, and it also results in women thinking that they are not suitable for the leadership position.
Yeah, exactly. Like this is one of the main reasons and one of the main drivers I will talk about, and also one of the main issues that influence so many other issues. So this is almost like the groundwork or the ground theory behind it, because we have certain views of men, we have certain views of women, we have certain views of leaders, or we have certain views of typical engineers, of typical nurses, and there is a fit or not a fit between these views or stereotypes that we have, both about the genders as well as the occupations or fields and areas. And that leads to different types of consequences that I'll be talking about here today. Thank you very much. Then also maybe to introduce one metaphor. So you all may be familiar with the metaphor of the glass ceiling, but that's a bit outdated almost. So because we do see some female leaders, so there is no like ceiling that men and women can't go through. That women can't go through. That's keeping them out, because some women do make it to the top, but it's more of a labyrinth for women. So more so than for men. So women have to like take more turns. It's less clear what the direct way is, versus for men, what often happens is they can take more of a straight, directly through approach to the leadership positions, whereas for women it is a little bit more difficult. So the metaphor of the labyrinth kind of gets more at what's actually happening in many organizations and kind of keeping women from leadership positions. So I want to talk a lot about stereotyping and stereotypes and what the outcomes of these is. So first of all, to define stereotypes, stereotypes are generalized assumptions about certain groups. Here I'll talk a lot about gender stereotypes, so assumptions of the group of women, what are women like, the group of men, what are men like, but we have stereotypes about all kinds of things, all kinds of groups. So we have stereotypes about older people, younger people, about leaders, non-leaders, about punks, about gothics, about like all kinds of like any group you can think of. We usually have some kind of stereotypical association about them. And those stereotypes can be both descriptive and prescriptive. Descriptive means we have assumptions about what we think members of the group are like. So for example, men are like this, women are like this, but these stereotypes that we hold are also prescriptive, and prescriptive means how should men and women be like. So we have a view of an ideal woman is like, an ideal man is like, men ought to be like this, women ought to be like that. So it's these so stereotypes are kind of twofold. They both are, these are men and women, this is what they're like, and this is also how they should be like. And both of these types of stereotypes influence our evaluation of people and how people make career choices. So stereotypes, first of all, are useful in a way because we're confronted with so much information that they simplify information processing. Otherwise, we couldn't really go through today's world. There's just so many things happening all the time, so many things we're confronted with that they help us just to, kind of categorize and look at what's most important. So in a way, they are useful. They serve like a good function, but of course, they often lead to mistakes. Because even though we might think all men are analytical, that's of course not true. So we can't infer from the stereotype that men are analytical to you must be analytical because you're a man, but that also often happens. So even though it helps us organize the world, stereotypes, they also have this downside, obviously, of being very, leading to mistakes and potentially hurting career advancement or career choices of men and women. So the first thing I want to say is that we are kind of surrounded by stereotypes all the time. So you see lots and lots of books about what men and women are like and how we should deal with these differences. Also, being the strong men and women want, so what we should be like. So you have that everywhere, kind of in the bookstore, in the media, etc. You constantly see what men and women are like and what they also should be like. And even you see that for kids already. I think this is now not in the market anymore, but only a few years ago that could still be bought. The Brilliant Boys' coloring book and the Beautiful Girls. So already children are confronted with this early on in their lives. Where do the stereotypes come from? So that's kind of the basis of why we have these stereotypes, or why we have which types of stereotypes. Why do we think that men are a certain way? Why do we think that women are a certain way? And one theory that's very kind of famous and has been used a lot to explain that is a so-called social role theory. And the idea here is that we see men and women in different social roles. So because we see more women as kindergarten teachers, we see more women as the caretaker of the family, we infer certain characteristics. So to be a good caretaker, you have to be communal, you have to be concerned about others, you have to care about other people, you have to be helpful. Men we see more in, for example, leadership position or things-oriented occupations, and therefore you need more competitiveness, more risk-taking, more analytical skill, more rationality, and therefore because we see men and women in these different roles, that's how we infer stereotypes. And as you can see, that's of course already, for a long time in societies, men and women, in many Western societies at least, there are also some exceptions, men and women have been in these different social roles. And because we see more women in these people-oriented positions, more in part-time work and more as the family caretaker, we infer different characteristics of them. There's actually quite an interesting study done by Koenig et al., who I think showed just icons of like an alien race, and then they had the alien race work in either people-oriented occupations or in things-oriented occupations. I might get the details of the study wrong, but the general idea is something that then, even when people knew nothing about this alien race, they would infer stereotypes. So the alien race people that worked in the people-oriented occupation were seen as more communal, so as more helpful, as more concerned about others. The alien people that worked more in the things-oriented occupation were seen as more analytical, as more competitive, as more agentic, what it's called. So that's kind of there we can see that it's truly that way around, so that we truly see men and women in certain types of roles, and therefore we say, okay, because they are in these roles, that means they must be so-and-so. If it were the other way around, if we would, for example, see a lot of, that's the theory at least, if we would, and there are some findings that support this, if we would see more women in leadership, if we would see more men in nursing or caretaking jobs, we would have different stereotypes. So there is some, there is some change possible, but it's taking a long time. Okay, and so we have these stereotypes, we infer what are men like, what are women like, but then how does it happen that we also see ourselves in a certain way? And what happens is that children are learning about these gender stereotypes. There are some also biological reasons, and of course there's always a discussion how much is biology, how much is social, but we do know that to a large part at least there are social reasons for why we have these self-stereotypes and self-characterizations in a stereotype-consistent way. So what happens is that as soon as children kind of realize they belong to one of the gender groups, I'm also, as a side note, not talking here about non-binary, which is still, then in a whole different research area. So for the sake of just keeping it simple for the talk, we'll just talk about men and women here. But of course, I'm aware that there are other genders and there are then other processes going on as well. And the second disclaimer is, even though we'll talk here about gender differences, that obviously doesn't mean that that's true for every single man or every single woman. So what we talk about here is like mean differences in the groups of men and in the groups of women, and then there are lots of women that are not like this, lots of men that are not like this. But overall, over all the people combined, we do see some difference there. Okay, so back to the point I wanted to make is that children learn about these gender stereotypes and these roles, and they're also very motivated. So as soon as they realize, oh, I'm a boy, I'm a girl, they are motivated to look to others that are also boys and girls, to grown-ups of their gender, and they are motivated to behave and act like they see other people behave and act. That's one reason, and the other reason is that they are also gender-conform behavior is reinforced. So when girls are more helpful, adults pay more attention to them. When boys are more risk-taking, etc., they also get more positive feedback. So they kind of learn both through, oh, I see others behave in this way, and others react positively to me if I behave in this gender-congruent way. That's kind of how these stereotypes get internalized, and we do then see some gender differences. Also, of course, with the disclaimer that there are large inter-individual differences, so it's obviously not the case that all women are like this and all men are like that, that would be stereotyping then again. One study I wanted to show you just, because that's also often, an argument that parents make is that, oh, but already the kids choose gender-congruent toys. And in this study, they found that at 12 months, also a mean difference, so in like a mean of boys who were 12 months old, they didn't have, and girls, they didn't have a preference for cars versus baby toys, but then when they're 18 months old, so only 6 months later, they had developed this gender-congruent preference, so that boys like cars more and girls wanted to play with baby dolls more. Okay, so now I've talked a lot about how stereotypes develop and what they are, but I haven't really told you yet what research says what are actually stereotypes. So how do we see men and women? And I have some data from the US. That's a study that I ran with 2 colleagues in 2000, or that was published in 2019. And that I want to tell you about. And I do have some data from the Netherlands for the self side. So for self-stereotyping, that is very similar to the data I'm showing here on, very similar to the US data. I don't yet have the data for how men and women are viewed in the Netherlands, but I expect that they are probably also quite similar. So what we did is we asked a group of people, please rate men in general, another group of people, please rate women in general, and another group of people, please rate yourself on a large number of adjectives. And so then we found this. So here, just to explain the graph to you, what this means is this is always the scale. So it's like an agency scale. So this is a combined measure of how assertive is this group described, how bold, how dominant, and how competitive. And the higher the number, the more agreement. So in this case, here, men were asked to rate other men and women. So you see always in blue how men in general are rated, and in red, how women in general are rated. So here, male participants in the study rated men higher on assertiveness, being bold, being dominant, being competitive, as compared to women. And the star shows that there's a significant difference. So that means like in a calculation, that is different. So male raters see men as more assertive. Female raters the same. Female raters also think men are more assertive. And when you ask, how do you see yourself? Women also say, I'm less assertive than men would say that they are assertive. However, when we look at independence, which is also kind of an aspect of agency, so being independent, desiring responsibility, being emotionally stable, being self-reliant, we actually don't really see a difference in how women see men and women and how men and women see themselves, but we do see that men stereotype somewhat more, and men will say, well, actually, men are more independent than women. So there's already a bit of a change from older studies on stereotyping, where, let's say, in the 60s or 70s, we would still have seen differences here as well, where women would have been described as less independent as men. But in this study, we don't see that difference anymore. We only still see it for male raters. With regard to communality, which is the stereotypically feminine attributes like being compassionate, being kind, sympathetic, or understanding, we again see a very traditional picture. Both male raters and female raters will say, well, women are more communal, more concerned about others than men, and men and women will also say that about themselves. Interestingly, here you can see that men actually rate themselves as much more concerned about others than they are seen by other people. And also interestingly, for sociability, which is being communicative, collaborative, relationship-oriented, we also don't see a difference in self-ratings. So men and women will say, oh, we are equally sociable. They will give themselves equal values on sociability, while people will still stereotype women as being more sociable as compared to men. Then also some good news, that's also a change from earlier stereotyping studies. Instrumental competence, so kind of getting the job done, being competent, being effective, being productive, we don't see any differences in the genders. So men and women are seen as generally equally competent, which is really good news, and that wasn't the case a few decades ago, where men would be seen as more competent. And also men and women rate themselves as equally competent. However, when we look at leadership competence, so being achievement-oriented, having leadership ability, being skilled in business matters, there we still see actually, and that's quite an interesting finding, that only women will say men and women are equally competent in leadership. Men will say, well, men are more competent in leadership. And men and women themselves, well, actually, their men will also say that they are more leadership competent. And here in this graph, you also see something quite interesting, because women will rate themselves actually as lower on leadership competence than they rate other women. So women are more likely to say, oh, women in general are very leadership competent, but I'm not as much. And that's quite a problem, because that means that women have internalized the stereotype about leadership competence more for themselves than they have for other women. So that's kind of what happens. You see, or then how stereotypes work. You see a behavior, maybe the same behavior of a man and a woman, and then you have different associations because of their gender, and people also make themselves different associations because they belong to one of the gender groups. There was a lot about descriptive stereotypes, so how are men and women seen? There are also some studies on prescriptive stereotypes, so what should men and women ideally be like, and what do we associate, what expectations do we have of men and women? And there we see a similar picture. So women are required to be more communal, so more sensitive, more friendly, more warm, more cooperative, but they should definitely not be controlling, arrogant, stubborn, self-promoting, or dominant, at least in some setting. That's really not, okay for women. And then they will, I'll say a few more things about that later on, receive backlash so that they are less liked and more negatively evaluated if they do show these types of behaviors. And for men, we see also quite a similar picture than for the descriptive stereotypes. So we see that men are required to be, or ideally men should be more self-reliant, more ambitious, more rational, more decisive, but they should not be weak, naive, shy, emotional, or too feminine, versus while these things are okay for women. And and what happens is that then if they do show these types of behaviors, then there are more negative social consequences oftentimes for them. So there are both about these descriptive stereotypes, the prescriptive stereotypes, and self-stereotypes. There are a lot of consequences for career, both how men and women are hired and how men and women make career choices. But for the sake of time, because it's such a large research field, I'll only be talking about self-stereotyping here. Whenever I will mention some of the other findings as well when it fits, but there would be a whole separate talk basically to also tell you about the consequences of prescriptive and descriptive stereotypes that are also, of course, manifold and a lot of barriers that come towards people's ways that want to enter in non-traditional career paths. But here I will only talk about the results or outcomes of these self-stereotyping choices. Okay, so I'll focus a bit on leadership, but a lot of the things I say here apply not only to leadership, but also generally to fields that are opposite gender. So for women in fields that are male-dominated currently, and for men in fields that are female-dominated. But to kind of explain this difference in leadership. So we have seen in the studies that women are seen as more communal, men are seen as more agentic. They also see themselves as more communal as compared to, so women see themselves as more communal than men see themselves as more agentic than women. And first of all, one effect here is the women are wonderful effect. So that's great. Like these attributes that we associate with women, like being helpful, being communicative, being understanding, are really positive. So it's not a negative stereotype that we have of women. We do think they are actually great. But the downside is that leaders or other more male-dominated positions are seen also as more agentic. So leaders are seen as more bold, as more competitive, as standing up under pressure. So what happens is that we have a think manager or think leader, think male stereotype. So whenever, like Lisanne said in the beginning, whenever we think of a leader, we think of a male person and we associate male characteristics with them. That is changing a bit because we do talk more about communal aspects of leadership and caring for people, but traditionally, especially the higher the leadership position goes, the more male-typed attributes, stereotypically male-typed attributes, agentic attributes, we still associate with these positions. So while it is changing to an extent, we still see leaders as masculine to this day. And what happens is that then, and that's a theory that applies to both kind of how men and women see themselves as well as how others see men and women, is what happens is we have the stereotypes about the group, so the way men and women see themselves or the way people view men and women, and we also have the perceived job requirements. So for a leadership position, you need to be assertive, or for being a nurse, you need to be very caring, etc. So you have these attributes that you associate with the job, and you have the attributes that you associate with yourself or with men and women. And what can happen is that you have an assessment of poor fit. So that, staying with the example of women in leadership, women might see themselves as lower on agency than men, but they will see themselves as more communal. That leads to, I don't fit as much into leadership positions as men do, because they have more of a fit between how they view themselves and how they view leaders. That can lead to expectations of failure, thinking, I won't do really good in this job, the requirements are so high, I'm not even that assertive, but they're looking for someone really assertive. I'm not sure if I can actually perform well there. Or they might think, I don't really belong in this setting, I wouldn't feel comfortable with a very competitive climate because I'm just not that kind of person. And that can then lead to negative evaluations and biases, so deciding to not apply for, let's say, like a trainee program that will eventually lead you to a leadership position, or for entering in male or female type dominated jobs if you're of the opposite gender. And that then has some behavioral consequences. So there are quite a few studies that show overall men have higher leadership aspirations and higher power motivation as compared to women. That depends a bit. I'll show in the end when I talk about intervention opportunities also a bit that that's not the case in all settings, but overall we do see that men have a higher power and leadership motivation. it also is the case that people tend to have a lower self-confidence in opposite sex settings. So women in male-type fields will have a lower self-confidence, or men in female-type fields, even though on general men also tend to be more overconfident. So they are more likely to say they are more confident than they actually are. There are some studies that it's quite interesting, the research. So people are giving a questionnaire with a few, really questions on just like general knowledge questions. Who painted this painting, this and this person? And then they're asked to give the answer, and then they're also asked, how sure are you of this answer? And so men tend to say they are more sure overall on these questions, and they might even be oversure on answers that they're actually not correct, versus women tend to be more hesitant. That's, again, of course, overgeneralization, so that's obviously not true for every man and every woman, but in general we do see these findings. And that kind of relates then also to what types of tasks men and women choose when they work in opposite sex settings. So, for example, women would choose lower challenging tasks when they're in a male-type setting, and that is a problem because the challenging tasks usually are the tasks that are very visible, and that then also lead to promotions. So when you already decide, I'm not going to do that, I might not be good, I might not do it well enough, then that can actually prevent your career advancement. And that's also a finding that we see that leaders also attribute less challenging tasks to women in male-type settings. So that's something that comes from both sides. So women choose those tasks less, and they are also given these tasks less. Then we also know that people tend to choose more for teamwork rather than individual work in opposite sex settings. So when women have to change motor oil or something in the car, they're more likely to want to do that in a group rather than by themselves. Or men, I think they did in the study, decorate a window and make it all look nice, like a sales window. So they would then choose to do that in a team rather than alone. And that can have negative consequences in that sense. I mean, usually teamwork is great, but under certain circumstances that can be negative, because if a team is given joint feedback, so for example, your team did an excellent job, what happens then is that in male-type settings, women will be more likely to say, oh, that's due to my partner, my male partner. He did the major part of the work, it wasn't really me. And that's something that, again, is a finding that happens for both kind of self-interpretation, as well as for what other people think as well. So if you then ask an outsider, oh, who do you think contributed more to this joint teamwork, and it's a male-type task, people will be more likely to say the man contributed more than the woman. But even worse almost is that the women themselves will also say that. And that doesn't happen in female-type settings. And what also happens is that because people see themselves a certain way, so women as more communal, men as more agentic, there are some studies that show that that's one reason why women won't enter traditionally male organizations, but also fields. So for example, there's a lot of research on so-called STEM fields, so that's science, technology, engineering, mathematics, where women are less likely to enter. And that's because they think these positions would not afford them that they have a communal goal, like they want to work in a team, they want to be communicating in their job, and they think in these fields people don't do that. So they have the stereotypical view that they are maybe just sitting in front of their computer by themselves all the time, which is not true, but that's the view that they have. And because then they think, oh, in these types of fields I couldn't afford these goals, I couldn't be communal as much as I want to, then they choose to not enter into these fields. So one way we'll talk about in the end a bit is kind of changing the view of certain positions to make more of a fit between the positions and the way men and women see themselves. Another factor that happens or that results from stereotyping is a theory called Stereotype Threat. And so that's been shown a lot with women in math, but also some other fields. So for example, there's the stereotype, girls are not good in math and boys are not very sensitive. And what happens if that stereotype is activated? So if people believe on this test, women are doing less good, or men are doing less good because it's on emotional sensitivity or it's on math, what happens is they actually perform worse. So they become so occupied by not conforming to the stereotype that their mind is more occupied with thinking about, oh, I shouldn't conform to the stereotype. But then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then they actually don't do as well as compared to the very same test without telling them beforehand, this is on emotional sensitivity and men do worse, or this is on math and women tend to do worse. So if they don't get this information up front, they'll do equally well, but if they do get this information up front, they will actually perform worse. So for women, this has been shown, for example, in math settings. It also has been shown already after women talked with in engineering, talked with a person who was sexist and was kind of making sexist remarks. They actually performed less well on engineering tasks. And that has also been shown for after women saw kind of stereotypical commercials where men and women had very traditional roles, they also had lower leadership aspirations. And for men, this has been shown on a test, for example, on emotional sensitivity or social sensitivity. Then the third theory I want to talk about is so-called backlash avoidance. And as I've said, that there are also these prescriptive stereotypes, so how men and women should be like. And just to recap, so when women are too dominant or doing too much self-promotion, talking too positively about themselves, they receive backlash in the form that they are less liked or then even seen as not so hireable because they don't really conform to the expectations that people have of them. And for men, that's also been shown for when they're too feminine or too successful even at traditionally female-type jobs. So male elementary school teachers would also be confronted with backlash, or if men are too modest. And what happens is that people are aware. They know that this is happening. They know that that there are these, that if they behave in certain ways, they will receive backlash. So they're quite strategic about their behavior, and they try to avoid that. So, for example, for men, it's less likely that they enter into traditional female occupations, but also they will, for example, take shorter parental leave or spend, focus more on the job as compared to the family. And that is true in terms of that both men and women that do take longer parental leave times will be seen as less ambitious in their work, or people that work part-time will be seen as not as motivated for their career. So in a way, it is strategic to not do that, but of course it's terrible that this is happening, that people make these choices because they're afraid of negative outcomes. For women, that's been shown that they refrain from self-promotion, so they will to not be seen as too pushy or too as not as too self-promoting, not as too arrogant. They will not self-promote as much. And in another study that's been shown, and that's also a very important finding for salary negotiations, so that women will think, oh, I will be seen as too demanding or too pushy if I ask for more money. And so in one study, an experimental study, they even found that women negotiated 8,000 euros per year less money than men did. And that was for that reason, because then they were asked, okay, why did you enter these and these numbers? And the reason was that then they would think they would be seen as too pushy or too demanding. Okay, so that's quite an overview. There are, of course, a lot more findings and a lot more studies, but just to give you some idea of the processes that are going on. What I want to shift to next is what can we do about this? So now we know that these processes are happening, and what can we do to actually increase gender equality? And as you might have seen, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and one goal, the goal number 5, is gender equality. So how can we reach that goal, develop our societies in a sustainable way, and strive for gender equality? And by gender equality, I don't necessarily mean that everything has to be always like super equal, but with gender equality, I mean that everyone feels free to decide what they really want without, for example, being afraid of backlash or, having stereotype threat effects, or creating an equal society where it doesn't matter anymore what gender you have, but everyone has the freedom independent of their gender to choose whatever they want to do. And in a way we have that, but we also see these effects of that there is backlash when people don't conform to gender equality, so that we should strive for that not being there anymore. So as you've seen, the lack of fit theory that I explained before, there's quite a few areas that we could get at. We could change stereotypes about the group. We could change what the job requirements are. We can change that people don't expect failure anymore or have negative evaluations. And one thing up front, it's quite difficult to change stereotypes. So over time, as you know, when gender roles do develop, the stereotypes will also change, but it's a very long process and it's very difficult to do that. So it's easier to change the perceived job requirements, for example, first, then have more, let's say, women in leadership, and then via seeing more women in leadership, we also get more of a gender-balanced picture of leaders, for example, that will then eventually lead to a change in self-stereotyping or stereotyping. And I'll talk both here about what are some strategies for men and women, but also what are some strategies for organizations and managers. And one thing I want to say here, even though I do say what men and women can do to kind of prevent some negative outcomes, I want to say that it shouldn't be a fixing the woman type approach, because what often happens, women just need to be more dominant, they just need to be more outgoing. But that's actually terrible, because then women have to, adapt to like a culture that might not even be fitting for them. So it should always be authentic, and ideally it comes more from the organization or management side to make everyone feel included and welcome. But I do want to say some things here as well that women can do, as long as it feels authentic. So what are some strategies for women and men? So one thing is, of course, self-reflection, to really reflect upon what are my strengths. And one other interesting question one can always ask, what would others think are my strengths? So sometimes we get stuck in our own head too much. And with, for example, coachings, that can really help to think about what do other people actually see that I'm good at, and how does that fit with me, and really do a lot of reflection, because with reflection we learn and we get to know one another, ourselves better. Relatedly, mentoring and training works very well. And there are also some interesting studies on role modeling. So having, for example, female role models can be really good for women, with also a disclaimer. Female role models are only actually working very well if the success of the role model is seen as attainable. So only when people think, I can actually make it to the position that woman has, will they also be striving for the position. If they think, this person is so good, they are just so amazing, I'm not anywhere close to them, then actually female role models won't do any good. So it really, the success has to be seen as attainable. And leadership trainings are questioning, why do I want to lead? What's my motivation to lead? Those types of things, also related to reflection, can be very helpful as well in getting to, reflect upon your own self-stereotypes. Then also, just being aware that the first impression of certain types of fields or position is not always the correct one. It's also a good strategy, as I said, with the science, technology, engineering, mathematics stereotype that they are always working alone and being analytical all the time. That's not necessarily true. There's lots of teamwork going on in these fields as well. So kind of reflecting upon, are my stereotypes of the job actually accurate? Or at least being open that they might not be as accurate, that can also already help to be more open to all kinds of career paths. And finally, seeking feedback and career goal advice from, let's say, supervisors and others in the organization. Because what also sometimes happens is that we think, my supervisor will find out how great I am. I just have to wait for them to see. But that often doesn't happen, because people are very occupied. They don't pay always enough attention. So one thing can be to proactively talk with the supervisor and say, this is my career goal, can you help me? And really be, transparent, ideally. And then I'll say that if there's a setting, an inclusive setting where people feel comfortable of doing that. But one strategy can be to actually talk about this with supervisors. Also, a short excursus talking about salary negotiations, because I said with the 8,000 euros that women have been negotiated lower as compared to men. What can women do for better negotiation outcomes to not receive backlash as much? One thing that actually organizations have to do is make clear negotiation rules and standards. So, for example, say here in this setting, we tend to negotiate very perseverant and very agentic, and this is expected of everyone, things like that. So kind of setting rules for the negotiation can help make everyone feel comfortable, and then kind of just adhering to the rule rather than to the idea of if I am too agentic, I will be negatively evaluated. Also, but that's of course difficult to realize in many situations, but in some situations this can work, is negotiate for someone else. So in that same study where women negotiated 8,000 euros less for themselves, actually when they were negotiating on behalf of another person, they would have the same outcomes as men, negotiation outcomes as men. So it was really the fear of being negatively stereotyped themselves or as receiving backlash themselves that made them negotiate less well. They could have, or they can actually negotiate much better if they're negotiating for someone else and don't fear, then they don't fear that backlash as much. Also, adapting the negotiation style to the other negotiator works well. So if the other negotiator is very perseverant, one can also be more perseverant. So kind of just matching or mirroring that style. Another good strategy is explaining why demands are legitimate. So, for example, a higher salary for me is fitting because I have this extra training, I have these extra skills here and there. That's why I should be getting more. So, kind of really saying why rather than just saying the number. Also, a good strategy is tempering agency with communality. So not only being super agentic, but also being communal at the same side. So being warm and, focusing on a good relationship between the negotiation partners can work. And in line with that, for everyone, not just for women, small talk is a really good start of a negotiation, because then you get to know the other person, you find similarities. So usually groups that start with small talk then both parties have better negotiation outcomes. With a disclaimer here is actually when men do small talk, they get an even bigger bonus than women. So it's almost like a communality bonus effect, because communality is not so expected of men. So women are required to be communal, men are not. But when men are communal, so for example, when they are doing small talk, also when they lead in a more communal style, they will actually have even better outcomes, because people are like, oh wow, he's so communal, will really stick out because it's not expected. Okay, what are some strategies for organizations and managers? First, targeted recruitment. So going to college campuses, talking to women, actually, telling them more about the job. And there's also a nice kind of bonus effect for organizations even, that the managers that do go and do this targeted recruitment, they tend to have more support for diversity themselves as well. So it can pay to actually send maybe the most critical people to do these college visits, because they will be more likely to be on board and think that diversity is a good idea and support that more. Also workshops, gender fair recruitment. So one reason why stereotypes play such a big role is because of a lot of ambiguity or no structure, and the more kind of ambiguity, the less structured job interviews are, the more likely stereotypes play a role. So for example, if you ask different questions to all interviewees, and maybe even questions that are biased, because you'll ask women about family time but men not, then that becomes a problem. So having more standard, like more structure, more standard in both recruitment and selection can work well. And there are really nice workshops that can explain like what a really good professional selection process look like. Also workshops on stereotype sensitization. Those don't always work super well, and there's even one downside that one has to consider, because what sometimes happens in those workshops is that people go out and say, oh, we're all stereotyped, there's nothing we can do about it, and that actually reinforces stereotypes. There's a really nice study that's actually not on stereotyping, but that shows how norms work, and I think it was like in a national park in the US, researchers would put up a sign and say, please don't take little pieces of wood, because a lot of people are taking these pieces, so we're losing too much of the forest. And what happened is that people would actually take more wood, because they would think, oh, everyone does it, so I can also take a little piece. It doesn't really make a difference. So the thing or the takeaway here is to be aware of, okay, we have these stereotypes, but the norm is that we're working on actually minimizing them and minimizing the effects they have. So it's really important to not kind of go out and say, oh, we have this also. Okay, no matter, we can't really do anything about it. But it should really be about, okay, we have that, but we are all motivated to actually change something and create more gender equality. Then the supervisor can do actually quite a lot of things. So they can really ask, and not just kind of assume because there's a mother of 3 children that she doesn't want to have a career. Maybe she does. So it's really about talking and going into communication with the people. Giving support for non-traditional career paths, so also supporting when men choose for long family leaves, so just being open and questioning own biases. Creating inclusive climates, so that means kind of making people feel both that they belong, but also that they bring a unique value into the group. And kind of the basis for all of this is so-called, researchers call this psychological safety. So kind of making people feel safe to be honest and authentic, and being non-judgmental, and really creating an environment where people feel like, okay, I can actually talk to my supervisor without being judged. And then I want to make talk a little bit more, because there are some of my own studies that I want to present about what can be done with recruitment advertisements. And as you can see, there are already small changes that can already, create a difference. And so in this study, we wanted to find out, can women's fit perceptions to leadership positions be heightened if leadership is described with more communal words rather than agentic words? So what we did is we had men and women read advertisements, and these were job advertisements for management trainee positions. So we're looking for, young professionals that were just kind of entering into organizations, or that were in their first 10 years of working in organizations, where you kind of make the decision of whether or not you're going to enter a leadership career path or not. And then we showed them either an advertisement that had only agentic words, only communal words, or mixed. And that looked something like this. So they would read either in red, you can see the agentic terms, and green, the communal ones. So you'll carry out demanding leadership tasks, or you're engaging tasks with responsibility for employees. So in a way, we try to make it's not always 100% the same, but it's all things that leaders do. And we try to keep it a little bit similar, like ambition or goal commitment, entrepreneurial thinking, orientation towards sustainability, influence versus responsibility, etc. So you can see that it was a bit longer, so this is just an excerpt, but like with kind of, as you can see, depending on how you describe the position, you kind of transport a different image, even though all of the things that we mention here are things that leaders or managers would be doing. And this is what we find. So you can see here, women in red, men in blue. This is a low lack of fit with leadership. So how much do you not fit with leadership positions? It's a high lack of fit. So as you can see, with agentic wording, women perceive a higher lack of fit with leadership. So they will be more likely to think, I don't fit into this position. With androgynous wording or mixed wording, you still see a bit of a difference. I think that's not always significant, but here it was. But when there's communal wording, you actually don't have that anymore. There's no more difference between how fitting men and women see themselves for leadership positions. And then, as you can see, for men, it doesn't really matter. Actually, for men, it's not significant, but there's even a trend that men also prefer the communal wording. because it might be generally more inclusive. And as if you recall the very first study that I presented on, that men tend to describe themselves as more communal as they are seen by others. So that also kind of fits this idea that men don't mind communality. So having communal wording is kind of generally inclusive. And so what happens is that kind of the gender of the person and the job advertisement wording interacted to create a lack of fit with leadership, and that then influenced also application intentions and leadership aspirations. And I don't have the numbers here, but actually for leadership aspirations, men and women only differ in the condition of the agentic wording. So only after having read an advertisement with agentic wording were men more likely to have higher leadership aspirations than women. But after they saw, mixed wording or communal wording, there were no differences between the genders. So this is really about that. The environment one creates or the way a job is described that makes a difference. There's even another study by researchers from the US that focused on computer science, and they had people go into a room, and the room was had either pictures of traditional stereotypical computer science things, so Star Trek poster, empty Coca-Cola or also full Coca-Cola things, chips, like very kind of stereotypically computer science, or a room with like more gender-neutral nature posters. And what they found is then when they had women fill in the questionnaire in the room that was more stereotypical, they were less likely to want to enter computer science fields. So it was only the surroundings. There was like nothing in the questionnaire different, but it was only like the way the room looked that already made them make other choices. So there's a lot actually that organizations can do to, create an environment where opposite genders will feel comfortable. Also, another study, recruiters that we did is where we had was only female students here, and it was for leadership development fellowship. And they saw again an advertisement with either agentic characteristics or communal. And then there was either a male recruiter or a female recruiter that they saw that would talk about this position. And so what we find is actually with the female recruiter, wording didn't really matter. So it was fine to have agentic or communal wording, actually only for younger people. Overall, wording still mattered if you also had more older women in the sample. But when you had a male recruiter, you had to have communal wording, because otherwise when you had a male recruiter and the agentic wording, so in a way you only sent masculine signals in the recruitment process. So everything's masculine. The recruiter is masculine. He talks about a position in a masculine way. Then women felt like, this is not for me. If there's at least one gender fair cue, like either the wording or a female recruiter, then that worked to create more of a fit perception and higher application intentions. So to summarize, we did some pictures for a blog entry. So here are some examples of what this can look like. So of course, very extreme, but just so you get kind of the idea of what can be done. So to summarize the talk, this is what I talked about today, is a lack of fit perceptions and how they influence career choices. Stereotype threat, so how we actually sometimes do perform worse on gender incongruent tasks if we are, if the stereotype is salient, and backlash avoidance to conform to expectations that others have of us. And what can be done about it is everything is kind of in this. In the whole area of increasing diversity with gender fair recruitment and creating climates for inclusion, psychological safety, where people feel comfortable independent of their gender. If you're interested, you either can sign up with on this link, or I also have a list to pass around. You can leave your email address in a few years, maybe in 3 years or so. I will organize a theory practice exchange conference with new research findings that I have from the grant I will be starting. So whoever is interested either on that or on getting research updates or on also even becoming a study participant, so feel free to leave your email either on the list or online. Then that was it from me. Thank you very much, and happy to hear questions.
So thank you, Tanja, for this very insightful talk. So I've learned a lot, and I hope you too. I'm pretty sure you all did. It's a lot of food for thought. So as a moderator, I would open the floor for the Q&A now. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I will supply the microphone. So it can either be a question for Tanja, where you want her to explain something a little bit in more detail, or something about the studies, or just a general question about gender bias.
Or also your own experiences, if you want to share something that happened and that you want to note.
Hey, it was really interesting and thought-provoking. Thanks so much. And I was just thinking at the slide of the behavior consequences when you talked about the promotion and avoidance of promotion, and also the challenging tasks, that I also see that challenging tasks can be different for men and women because of the labyrinth that you also showed at the first slides. So while a task can be challenging for a woman because it's a labyrinth to reach that point, the promotion, for example, it can be more straightforward for a man who might not be that skilled, I would say, because then the woman has more diverse experience, more skills. And I really see this during my career. And it's very interesting to experience.
That's very true. It's both that men have maybe already acquired before more skills that make them seem more fitting, or maybe even more skilled for these tasks. And then at the same time you have these self-confidence issues maybe. Yeah. Thank you very much. Lisanne, can you pass that?
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Lots of information. I was thinking, so you referred to the commonality bonus. So does it mean when men are both agentic and both communal, or also when they are only communal?
Yeah, that's super interesting. That's actually something I do want to research eventually. So because you do see both. You see when men are too communal, they also get backlash. And one theory that I have that it's not really been tested, that it might be both that either when they're both agentic and communal, that's really great for men, or when they're, for example, in a high status position, so agency is already assumed, so for a leader, a male leader, who is already, a status high, and then people know that he is very agentic and has like the male type qualities, and if he then is communal in certain ways, so communal in like more concerned ways, but not too feminine. So I think then that would also already be like a normative problem. But if it's more like overachieving a norm, so like being better at like something positive, like being more helpful, more concerned, then that's really positive. But there's not that much research yet on this, but we do see in some studies that especially for when agency is clear, that this communality bonus can happen, while in other situations where it's not so clear, they get more of a backlash. And then I've seen for men, it's often not that they are not liked, it's more that they are more seen as wimpy or weak or not respected as much. So they have like a little bit of a different type of social backlash for not conforming to the gender role. Thanks.
Thank you for your research and for your talk and for all this information. First of all, I always think something like I'm very angry when I'm hearing stuff like this because I'm a woman and I'm reading a lot about this and I'm coming here and I think that all the people in power should hear this because only they can decide about who is coming next. But I wanted to add my question to this, what you said before. I was thinking about there is already this bubble where it is very common as a man to have children, to bring the children at work, to have the startup, to have all these rules in the community, to be, for example, a feminist, to be really aware and woke. And this is like a microcosmos, right? But this also could be like a vision for the whole society. And now my question, sorry, a lot of thoughts. I was wondering what kind of maybe other discrimination also like have an impact on this, for example, like class or education, if you see if the men are, I don't know, in this class or they have like this kind of education or in this or this political view, then they are more like gender equal or not? Or what do you think? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. It's a super interesting question, and the research on this is almost just starting out. So it's called like intersectional research, where you have like 2 or more dimensions. So you don't only. So I presented research that was only on gender. We can also look at age or ethnicity or class, like you said. So there's not that much research yet, but we do that. It depends a bit. Sometimes it's like a so-called double jeopardy. So you are, for example, a woman of color, or you are an older woman. So you have like 2 dimensions that are more negatively stereotyped for certain positions. And then that kind of, it's almost like it adds up. So then you do... you have then even more negative outcomes, but it also depends a bit because sometimes the stereotypes are also different. So, for example, I'm not 100% into this research yet, but what I have noticed is I think there are some studies, for example, on stereotype threat and with ethnicities as well. And there you see, for example, Asians are stereotyped to be better at math. Black people are stereotyped to be even worse at math. And I think there are also some intersections that then Asian women, for example, will still do better at the test because they then the Asian stereotype outweighs the gender stereotype. But it depends a bit. So it's I can't give like a super clear answer because the research is almost just getting there. So while like now in the last decades it was more like either only gender, or only age, or only ethnicity, now people start looking more at the intersections, but there's just still lots to research and not that many that we know already. Thank you. But super interesting question.
So in the introduction, it was said that you also work with companies and organizations. And I'm wondering if you have a method or questions or approach, how you can explore what are the biases in an organization or in a team, how prevalent it is, so sort of scoping.
Yeah, interesting. So what we usually do is really just ask people in the organization, so either via interviews or via questionnaires, kind of asking them in these organizations, do you see that men are preferentially selected for leadership positions, that there's like the male norm is very central, those kinds of things, and then that can really influence. Like, so in the more male-typed organizations, you have more of these effects, and the more gender-balanced organizations, you have them less. It, of course, always depends a bit, but in general, the more stereotypically masculine the organizations, the more you have a lot of the effects here that I talked about. And then, yeah, we would usually get at it by asking people, and sometimes not then with organizations. We would then, because that's then. There, you can't infer causality from this, so you only know, okay, this is happening at the same time, so you know that there's a correlation, and then to get it, okay, does the masculine setting really influence, for example, how women negotiate, then we would run an experiment, and so we would put one group, kind of say, okay, this is a very masculine organization, these are the norms here, and another group in a setting where we say, oh, this is a gender-neutral organization, it's more of a cooperative climate, and then kind of see if people negotiate, for example, differently in these types of settings to then say, okay, well, actually, if we do change the climate, then we see that the behavior changes. And so that's kind of the approaches we work mostly with. But there are also then some diary studies where people just ask on a daily basis to say how they felt in the morning, maybe with whom they talked, then how they felt in the evening, those kinds of things. Thank you. I think that also in the back.
First of all, thank you for your talk as well. And I was just wondering if you have done research on the question of how self-stereotyping changes with women in leadership. So does it get better, or does it even reinforce self-stereotyping because higher positions mostly does mean working in a more male-dominated environment?
It's a super interesting question. So I don't know of a study that really investigated the change. We do see that women in leadership do tend to be more agentic in general. And then there is the question, did they adapt? Or do the women that are already very agentic make it to leadership? So that I think we don't have a final answer to yet, but we do see that then also if, for example, your leader role is more central, so where you see yourself more as a leader, women will also behave more agentically, or when their female gender role or their family role is more central at this moment, is more salient to them at this very moment, they will also be more communal, for example, or show more communal behaviors. So that's super interesting, but I don't know, or we don't know yet from research, I don't know a study that has tested if it's really a change. And I think it's probably a mix of both. So my hunch would be that women that tend to be more agentic are more likely to advance to leadership, and that then the role also makes them even more agentic. But so the only thing that we do know so far is that female leaders are more agentic, but not necessarily what's driving the effect, basically. So super interesting question for research. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the front, and then you're next.
Yeah, I was wondering what your take is on the working part-time debate. So some people argue that the reason why women are not advancing to leadership positions is because they choose to work part-time more often than men do. So what is your take upon this, and like what would you advise?
Yeah, so I think that so there is definitely research that whoever works part-time, men or women, have less of a chance of advancing to leadership positions. And I think that's the same here in the Netherlands. I know in Germany it's the case that oftentimes the decision for like a longer parental leave or part-time work is based on salary, and then the question is, oh, you know, the man has oftentimes more salary, so then it just makes sense for the woman to take more care of the kids. I think that's one reason, and the other reason is, of course, that a lot of women also want this, and that can be due to this internalized stereotype of, you know, really wanting to spend a lot of time with the kids. And then you could ask, well, why have women internalized this more than men? So why don't have men that same drive? That's something I will probably address in the next years in my research. So there, I don't know yet how that plays out. But the reason for the salary, that's interesting because there's another factor contributing to like having higher salary is, I think you all know this, is not just the negotiations that men and women make, but also usually fields in which a lot of women are present, they usually get paid less. So like nursing, etc., is paid lower than fields in which a lot of men are present. And there is some research that shows that, unfortunately, the more women enter into a certain type of fields, the lower status it becomes. And so that is a problem. Therefore, then it makes sense to make these kinds of choices, but that is something to ideally change, so that why do we pay social fields less? Like, there's no reason for it. I mean, maybe they make less money, and maybe a finance person would have good reasons for it, but to me, like on a just general level, I would say it doesn't make sense to value social work less, because it's super important and very relevant. But I think that's where these decisions come from, and then they lead to women not being chosen as often for leadership, versus when more men would choose to take part-time, they would also kind of free, in a way, time. So that is actually another approach that some researchers take, that they say, because men don't take over as much family responsibilities, women have to, and also they want to, but also they have to, and therefore it gets reinforced, and we don't really see a change in roles as much, versus when men would be saying, oh, I want to, each of us does 30 hours, and not you do 20 and I do 40, but each of us does 20, or in Germany where you have like a year of parental leave, each of us does 6 months or something. If you do that more, then you would be, more able to maybe change things, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I like the fact that in the end you say like women don't need like to climb up to be as agentic as men and have leadership position, and your recommendation was more going into let's talk more commune languages, more inclusive to everyone, that people can feel themselves and imply more equality in general. And I would have a question in terms of education. So at the roots, when you gave the example of 12 months and 18 months kids with toys and things, what would be your views on being agentic or more communal in terms of education to have more leaders, feminine leaders? What would you
that's
your views on this?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. I just recently read an article about that the change now, that was I think based on a study in the US, that nowadays, because we do want women to become leaders, so there's a lot of, our society wants that, and that's a really nice development. But what happens is that now everyone, men and women, so boys and girls, are kind of educated to be agentic and to be independent and kind of be ambitious. So what happens is that the society becomes less communal. And that's also a problem, because actually, like we said, women are wonderful finding, like the attributes, the communality attributes are really nice. So it would be really sad for society to lose that. So in a way, ideally, everyone would become both agentic and communal, and that kind of plays an equal role and guides our behaviors, I guess, in equal terms. Does that kind of get at what you mean? Or
yeah. No, it makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, that's a follow-up, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, then you follow up and then at the back.
Stefan, do you want to give the microphone?
But you say, okay, so both genders should become equally communal and agentic, but I don't agree. I think not every woman has to become agentic, or every man has to become communal. The thing is, the problem in evaluation and giving higher status to agentic behavior compared to communal behavior. If that's not the case, I mean, fine. If you want to be very communal, if you want to be very agentic.
Yeah, no, I think that's also what I meant. So I didn't mean to say like everyone has to have this. I just mean we should value as a society both things equally, and then to have everyone have the freedom to I think I didn't put it in the correct words, but I agree with this. But I think in our education, both should get equal value. Yeah.
Okay, so one more question at the back. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again. So referring to the payment question, I was wondering what's your opinion on that? Because I recently saw a report where it was shown that women in management boards are paid better than men in management boards. Of course, it is obvious that women are underrepresented in management boards, but at the same time, I was wondering, how could that happen? So are there maybe some attributes that differentiate better paid women from poorly paid women, or what is your viewpoint on that, or explication?
Yeah, I don't know the studies, so I can't vouch. Let's just take that is what happened. But I'm not sure if that's always what's happening. But I think when it happens, what can happen is there are some findings that, for example, women are preferred for leadership if they are overly great. So in terms of when they are really good in a male-type field, and when they are then when they're really overachieving, and compared to an overachieving man, they would be even more positively evaluated, because then people do see that they kind of overcome extra barriers. So people do know this, and then they're like, oh wow, it's like an expectancy violation in a way, like she even is so great, so she's even more great. And maybe that could account for then higher payments. Even though I'm not sure if that's always the case, because I also know that for the BBC there was like a large discussion about pay equality, and then once pay became transparent, it was shown that actually the female executives had lower salaries than the male, and then then the BBC also didn't handle it very well in terms of they didn't then say, okay, we didn't do this great, so now here everyone gets equal, but then they try to argue why I think it was she was the head of China correspondence and compared to the head of US correspondence, and they were trying to make a case why US correspondence is harder. As like just looking at that, you would say, well, probably China is harder for like a British person. So anyway, so then they were trying this. There was this whole thing. I think I'm not sure if it's resolved by now, but there it wasn't the case. But I could imagine when this happens, it might be due to this bonus that then, and then there's another. I'm not sure if this is happening there, but women are also preferred for leadership for. What's it called? Glass cliff. So for precarious leadership positions. So when a company does very poorly and then the person leaves, organizations are more likely to hire a woman, either maybe because they want to show there's a change, or because they think, oh, maybe we need a woman now, we need more communality or something like that. And then they're in these precarious positions, and these are, of course, not a great position to be in. So they are much more likely to fail because the position they are hired for are already less great. But I'm not sure if those would be then paid more. I don't know. But so this is my thoughts, but I can't answer it maybe 100%.
Yeah. I was thinking as well of the... You know that there's the fact that once the management board is diverse, the company becomes more successful. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's also a potential explanation that, you know, like more successful companies pay better, and obviously there are more women represented in the management board. Yeah. But it's just like a theory. It's a report from Germany, so the DAX companies, whatever they do, I don't know.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's we don't yet know for sure if that's a correlation. So in terms of, is it truly that women, like gender diversity in top management teams makes the company perform better, or is it that already companies that perform better have more space to actually value diversity and invest in diversity and then hire more women? So we don't know what's hen and egg. But yeah, that could definitely be a very good explanation as well, that when the company does well anyways, they also can pay more. Yeah, thank you.
So do we have more questions for Tanja? It can also be just relating an experience, so that would be also like interesting to Tanja, I think. So it doesn't have to be a question proper. If not, I have one. I have a couple actually, but I'm going to pick one because this might give people some time to think about their question or their experience. So I was wondering, so that's a little bit more, I guess, going into like the speculative realm, because you mentioned, I think at the beginning in one of the slides, that there's a difference in, or a generational difference in how people respond to the questionnaires and how they kind of like, so like say gender stereotypes work, or how like gender stereotypical they are. So my question is, so do you expect this to change for the younger generation? Because it's my impression that nowadays, younger people, but also older people, of course, are more aware of issues relating to gender and so on. So do you expect this then to change with like new research, new questionnaires and so on?
Yeah, so I don't know, but I think it can happen. So it depends, because I do think there's now more awareness about toys also, to not have, I mean, we still see that a lot, like there's still a lot of gender-biased toys, but organizations do become more aware of that. So one thing that I think is already starting to happen a bit, and is probably continuing to happen, is that women will eventually be seen as more agentic and also see themselves as more agentic compared to a few decades ago, and I think that will continue. It might not be as quick for men in terms of communality. So I think it just will take longer because almost the stereotype about men not being communal is more strong in a way, and also the roles of men have changed a bit. When we think about that stereotypes come from social roles, we see more changes in women's roles. That we see more female leaders, we see more women in power, or even in male type positions, but we don't see as many men in female type positions. Also a few, of course, but the change is just slower. So then you would expect probably the communality change also to take longer.
Yeah, but just a quick follow-up. So it might also be an issue of increasing the attractiveness of companies, right? So, I mean, if a lot of people care about these issues, right, and I would assume like a lot of younger people do nowadays, then in order to like attract good talent, you have to be aware of these issues, and you have to make an effort as a company to increase diversity and so on. So.
Yeah, true.
So I assume that most of the data comes from Western countries. Mm-hmm. Do you have any insights about how it is culturally determined and whether the effects are exacerbated or actually mitigated?
Mm-hmm. So there are definitely cultural differences, a lot, and there are some studies in non-Western countries, but not that many. I did a study with data in Nigeria as well, and there the stereotypes were quite similar, even though I think Nigerians were seen as more agentic than Germans, but also there were also these differences between men and women in Nigeria. And I do think that, I'm not sure if I remember, I have some data, but I haven't really looked at it, in Eastern Europe and Asia, and there I think we have men be more communal as well. So there, communality is more of a societal value, so then men have that more. But I'm not 100% sure what the exact distribution is, but the short answer is there are definitely a lot of cultural changes, but the men more agentic, women more communal, we do find in a lot of societies.
Thanks.
Did you see any difference in terms of size of the company? Like, if you compare a huge company to a small one, will the trends be the same, or did you see any differences there?
That's super interesting. Actually, I have also, oftentimes I include this question in a questionnaire, but I haven't really analyzed it from, I think from other studies, what happens is that maybe middle, I think, so I hope I don't say anything wrong here, but more the medium-sized companies are relatively stereotypical, versus no, but I'm not 100% sure actually, because in the big companies you have, I think in the middle companies often are family companies, so you do have more female leaders, I think, in part, but they're also in a way have less resources to really focus on diversity and inclusion. So there's more of the big companies actually start doing that, and then maybe the smaller ones adapt to it. So I think it's super interesting, but I can't give a definite answer. I would assume that there are differences, but I can't actually. Do you have maybe an idea on how this could differ? No, I was because I think it could go either way. It could be either that because the big companies are more aware, but they might that actually there's more inclusion, there's more diversity, but then it might also be harder for women in those big companies to make it when they're very competitive and male typed. So maybe it's an intersection between company size and the type of maybe whether or not there's a competitive versus cooperative climate. I could think that in the big organization, that would be my hypothesis, but would be something to test, that in big companies with cooperative climate, it's probably more equal, versus big companies with competitive climates, it might be even worse. I do know of, there's a really interesting blog, I'm not sure, I think it's like Sarah Fowler or something, who was working at Uber, so the car driving company, but she was one of the engineers, or she was working in the headquarters, and there was actually no inclusive climate at all for women. So women just left the company very quickly. I think she also left after a year, and she said even HR wouldn't respond to sexual, what's the term, so Yes, yeah, sexual. Thank you. Yeah, so there would be cases that women would say I was sexually harassed, but HR wouldn't really do anything about it. Or at one point they wanted to be appreciative of everyone, so they got I think leather jackets. But then because there were at that time only 3 women left in the company, they got a discount only for men. So all the men got a leather jacket and the women didn't get anything. Like it's like very strange things that happened there. So then eventually she left. So with these kinds of climates, then yeah, women also don't want to stay. And I think yeah, that might happen in companies that don't pay attention to these things. But it's very interesting. I actually should look at the data. Thank you.
Yeah, so I saw 2 more raised hands. So you were first, and then I'm going to go to you. Okay, unless it's a follow-up.
I just wanted to add that it's very interesting that we are talking about this. These are like the female words and characteristics, and there's the male words. And it's always like, yeah, when we are talking about leadership, then all this male stuff is the norm. And I know you said it's not about to making like a woman have a gap, and now they have to behave like all the men and use all the mannish words. But I think it's not really clear that we live in a society where everything what is like mannish, it's like our norm. And I think we have to think also about what is really leadership and working, and how we want to work as humans, and how we want to practice leadership, and what role plays emotion and education and family, and maybe how many hours I want work, and what's about my salary and stuff like this. And I know we are just like in the beginning and we are trying to be aware of this, but maybe not enough.
I think that's super interesting, and I fully agree. I think, and fortunately, people are at least starting to discuss it, so that leadership is does require a lot of communality and a lot of communication and a lot of really, showing individualized considerations to employees and really being there for them, which is more traditionally a stereotypically female attribute. And yeah, if that becomes more central, there will also be more of a fit between women in leadership. Yeah, fully agree. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up? No.
Thank you so much. I actually have 2 questions. One is in those big firms that really focus on diversity for women, do they actually have good programs to address sexual assault in the workplace? Because I do see some big firms that is really good at attracting women, but really bad for sexual abuse in the workplace. And the second question is, is it just a HR strategy to make it more diverse for women, but not really focus on when, for example, the woman wants to go up the layer to become CEO, the glass ceiling is always there for those big firms. So I was just wondering, can women just become the HR strategy to be making more diverse, to attract more minority groups?
So can you say yes? Or maybe let me answer the first one, and then maybe you can rephrase the second one
sure.
in a short moment again. So so I think what happens a lot is when with sexual harassment, it depends of course by company. So I think some companies handle it very well, and some companies not at all. And I do know there is some study on when diversity programs fail, and one program part that often fails is the so-called grievance procedures. So what you're basically saying in terms of having procedures in place where women can go to HR and say that something has happened. And I think what often happens is that they do the legal minimum, but they are often, so it's almost a difference between being compliant and being committed to it. So I think what can happen in many companies is that they do what's legally required of them, so they comply with the legal requirements, but they are not really committed and not really behind it. And that can actually hurt more, like in the Uber example. So I think it actually really hurt that the woman went to HR and then nothing happens. It was actually worse than if she would have never gotten to HR. So in a way, you kind of get the signal like, we don't really care, just keep quiet and do what you're told. So that can really be a downside and lead to actually more women leaving the company. And can you rephrase your second question?
Yeah, the second question is, does like recruiting more women become a HR strategy? Because it doesn't really look into the senior level women, their glass ceiling. It doesn't address that problem. As long as women are recruited into the firms, also does HR strategy recruiting more women becomes a general recruiting strategy to let more minority groups more interested in the firms.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I think that's what's probably happening, because I think now everyone's super concerned about gender equality, which is great, but the discussion also now widens about other stereotype groups, and I think in the same vein, it starts happening more. So there are some studies that show that when you have either more women, but also, for example, different ethnicities visible in top management, people become more attracted because to the organization, as then they see, oh, this is an organization that doesn't only say they value diversity, but we can actually see it in top management. So I think in that sense, it can help that strategy, and I think. I think what happens is, at least from my experience with companies, is that gender is now discussed almost everywhere, but also organizations do start discussing other things. I know in some companies that's not even a demographic characteristics, but inclusion of, for example, shy and introverted people becomes really an issue. Like, what can you do to make them feel more included? So more about a personality characteristics rather than a demographic characteristic. So I think it does become more and more of an issue, but I think because women make up half of the people on this earth, that's kind of the first thing that organizations start with, and then they go to other marginalized groups. Thank you.
Okay, we're already slightly over time, so if there are no other pressing questions or remarks, there's nothing else for me to do as a moderator to dismiss you into the cold Amsterdam night. But thank you for your very insightful questions, and of course, thank you for participating. But before we all go, of course, join me in a very loud applause for Tanja.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you also for my part about all the questions, and discussion was super interesting. Thank you.